Not again, not again, not again. Hello and welcome to the Exploding Appendix podcast. In today's episode, we'll be talking to Elizabeth Otto about her book, Haunted Bauhaus, Occult Spirituality, Gender Fluidity, Queer Identities and Radical Politics. The session was recorded as part of the Exploding Appendix Avant-Garde Art Practice and Research Group, who meet regularly to discuss a range of ideas relating to the history of the avant-garde and radical counterculture, and other ideas relating to politics, history, philosophy, any kind of idea that we sort of see that's broadly related to the sort of general themes and explorations of the group. The sessions are free and they're open to all, so if you'd like to get involved, they're currently on hiatus, but they should be up and running again soon. They're both online and in person, so if you'd like to get involved, do send us a message. The in-person ones are in Brighton, so if you're based in Brighton, UK, then come along and join us when they get back up and going again. Or if you'd like to get involved, just send us a message at explodingappendix@gmail.com. You can also check out our work at www.explodingappendix.com. If you like this and you want to check out more of our stuff, please go there. Or just follow us on Facebook, Instagram, SoundCloud, YouTube, Twitter. This session was recorded on the 15th of June 2021. Anyway, yes, so that's it from me. Now over to the group and Elizabeth.
I just want to just welcome you to start with and just say that this is such a fantastic book. I've really enjoyed reading it. But you've also got like loads of books on, or you've had loads coming out lately, just all sort of really exploring different aspects of the Bauhaus. So this one goes through occult spirituality, gender fluidity, queer identities and radical politics. But you've also got ones on Bauhaus women's, a global perspective. You've got one on the photo montages of Marianne Brent, and you've also got Bauhaus bodies. I think some other ones as well, actually. But yeah.
So I've got some slides so I can show you some of that. But Bauhaus, Haunted Bauhaus, I'd say is my star book in some ways. The others are. My first book was the Marianne Brandt book. That one's important. They're all important, but the others are collaborative. And I'll explain that a little bit.
Did you want to do a little bit of an intro and just explain something about yourself?
Sure. Yeah. Shall I maybe share some slides?
Yeah.
What we talked about doing for those of you who didn't hear the chit chat at the start is I'm going to share slides but probably not go into the full screen view. So you'll have to tell me if can you see my slides pretty well here? Okay.
Looking fine to me.
Good. The idea is this way I can kind of surf around on the side. DJing is how I saw it. So yeah, here's the cover of the book that Bradley mentioned. And so these are some of the other books that came out recently, and they're all collaborative to different extents. So Bauhaus Women, I co-authored with Patrick Rossler, and it was a fun collaboration because his first language is German and mine is English, and we worked together a lot, and we each wrote about half of the essays. We had a few guest essayists, but we each wrote in our native language and then gave each other feedback, and then it was translated and we checked the translations and it was published simultaneously in German and English. So that was really nice to have it accessible to a wide audience in English, but also kind of speaking back to the German language audience in that. And that's a book of 45 short essays on Bauhaus women that we thought everyone should know, because very few people even know that there were women at the Bauhaus. It's certainly gotten better through the centenary. Bauhaus Bodies is a collection of essays by a number of scholars that we co-edited, and I'll probably be referring to some of those today because they're just really helpful, and they go into some of the specifics that then I drew on for Haunted Bauhaus. So one essay is on fashion at the Bauhaus, Bauhaus. Another is on, much more about gymnastics and body culture that I touch on and draw on and say some other things about. But it was just really helpful to get this body of work together. And then this is the exhibition catalog for a show that I curated with Patrick Hosler and two other art historians in Erfurt, and it was the only exhibition in the 2019 centenary of the Bauhaus's founding that focused exclusively on female designers. So that's Marianne Brandt, Gertrude Arndt, Margarete Hemann-Löwenstein, and Greta Reichelt. So a metal designer, a weaver and photographer, a ceramicist, and another weaver. So yeah, I could say a bit more about the Bauhaus just by way of background. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I think that could be really helpful.
Good. So here, just to kind of put it in front of you, is I'd say more traditional images of the Bauhaus that are certainly true to the school. On the top left is the Dessau Bauhaus building, which was designed by architect Walter Gropius, who is the founder of the Bauhaus school. And it was completed in 1926, and you can actually still visit it, and you can go and stay in this back building. You can just see a little sliver of it, but it's a total geek fest. The first time I did it, I could hardly sleep. I was so excited. And then a chair by Marcel Breuer, one of his bent metal chairs. That's also kind of a signature Bauhaus design element. This one's called the Vasily, but I'm sure all of us have sat in bent metal chairs, which were designed by Marcel Breuer and also Mart Stam about simultaneously, but certainly are kind of another signature look to the Bauhaus, because it's using modern materials to create something functional, light, appears to be easy to manufacture. In fact, these aren't easy to manufacture, but that's the idea, is that you could take something, supposedly Marcel Breuer was inspired by looking at the handles of his bicycle to think of making these chairs. And then on the lower left is a very small object. It's a tea extract pot. And this was designed by Marianne Brandt, the only woman to complete her degree in the metal workshop of the Bauhaus. And she made this actually during her first semester in the Bauhaus. And it evidences Bauhaus aesthetics as they're kind of widely known by using pure forms, right? The circle and the half circle, the sphere, and then the base is kind of a cross form. So there's a kind of symmetry and perfection to it. And this too also looks very sleek and modern. Robin Schuldenfrei, who is at the Courtauld, did a great book on luxury and modernism. And she points out that though this looks very modern and of our time, it's still a luxury object that is made of silver, ebony. They were incredibly laborious to manufacture by hand. They only appear to be machine manufactured. They couldn't machine manufacture them. So aspects, I think, of the Bauhaus aesthetic and what it's gesturing towards are often still very much, it's like they're trying to be digital, but they're still analog in a way. A really important part of where I'm coming from relates to this chart. I'm not usually that into charts, but this is something put together. It's in Bauhaus Bodies, this book I showed you here, by Patrick Hosler and Anke Blum, who is also a Bauhaus specialist and a collaborator who I work with often. And they, together with Magdalena Droste, had a German government funded grant to collect all kinds of information about the Bauhaus that helped to correct misperceptions about the school. So there have been important feminist interventions into the history of the Bauhaus that tended to focus on the institution's sexism, rightly so. I mean, it certainly, you can read in the the minutes of the Master's Council, which were all the professors of the Bauhaus together, that Gropius proposes late in 1919, so the year the school opens, that they had too many women and that they needed to start basically making it harder for women to get into the school, into the Bauhaus. And so they did that, even though it wasn't legal in the constitution of the Weimar Germany, women are supposed to have equal rights to men. But we see that there are just over 50% women in the very first year the school opens. in 1919, and that over time it goes down to about a third of all women. So the Bauhaus certainly was biased against its female students. Nonetheless, they were there. And one thing that really wasn't known before is that they were in every single workshop and program that the school ran. So what's always been said is that they were pushed into the weaving workshop. You'll hear that phrase, people still say it now. Women were all pushed into the weaving workshop. They were pressured to go in there. A lot of them did, kind of against their will, but they were in, pottery, architecture, surprisingly, which is thought of as extremely male-dominated, bookbinding, photography when that existed, as well as in weaving. And the weaving workshop was a pretty cool and progressive place. So the last thing I should say, just in case any of you aren't familiar with the Bauhaus, it was a school that combined an arts and crafts school together with a fine art school that were both already existed in Weimar. Walter Gropius was working on his plan to head this school to unite these two kind of different creative aspects that were seen kind of as hierarchically not equal, right? Fine art was considered the purview of genius, whereas crafts were much more considered something that anyone could learn. And he was working on all of this while he was an officer in the First World War. So it's an institution that is forged out of this crisis, comes into being with students who have all experienced war. Many of them were recently demobilized from war in that first year of 1919. And it exists during the same years as the Weimar Republic. So it's closed down by the Nazis in the spring of 1933.
Well, we're working on our own kind of publication, which is exploring the relationship between two words, reason and subversion, especially in relation to the history of the avant-garde. And it strikes me that your book itself also explores those two words. The first one bit more overtly, and the second one also at some level. So your book critiques the way in which Bauhaus is seen as the sort of paradigmatic movement of rational modernism, and explores how experiments in occultism, mysticism, lifestyle, sexuality, gender, and utopianism challenged a narrow interpretation of the Bauhaus associated with utilitarian functionalism. So it strikes me that there's sort of two ways that we could interpret this. On the one hand, you could say that the Bauhaus was not as rational as we have come to think, that in fact, their rational modernism was sort of haunted by occultism, experiments in living, utopianism, or we could argue that the Bauhaus had a more expansive conception of reason that sort of expanded beyond sort of utilitarian functionalism to include things like occultism, spirituality, and experiments in living. How should we understand what is rational in the Bauhaus, and how should we distinguish this from what is not?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I really like the way that you talk about how we might kind of expand the stakes of reason and the rational. So yeah, I always felt like, especially when I was teaching, surrealism gets to be the fun one, right? With all the sex and dreams and inappropriateness and weirdness. And, the Bauhaus is like the boring one at the party. And, but then when I was working in the archives, that just didn't hold up. I just started seeing so much wonderful weirdness of, all these kids in art school. And so that was much more the story that I wanted to tell. But I think you're definitely right. And here I'm showing you the image that I used to open the first chapter, which it's called Bauhaus Spirits, and it looks at how spirituality was really central to the school and how we might think of the Bauhaus rather than, an aesthetic, which they really bridled against this notion. They saw it as an approach, but certainly when we look back, we can see kind of two phases of the Bauhaus, an expressionist moment, and then a much more constructivist design, clean design kind of moment. But rather than thinking too hard about those. I wanted to see it more as a life reform movement, which was something that Germany really started engaging in already in the mid-19th century. Drawing, interestingly, because I was trying to figure out where life reform came from, and things like nudism that are still really important to different kinds of, often contradictory in terms of their politics, sets of ideas in Germany. And I found out that a lot of it comes from 18th century US. And in fact, Benjamin Franklin was a nudist. I did not know this. It was kind of surprising to me because I think of him as, an elderly gentleman in his suits. So, it's quite a larger, I'm tapping into larger sets of ideas, but trying to put this in a different context. And in terms of spirituality and the occultism, this is arguably a very pragmatic image in that it's a double exposed image. It allows us to see this pretty stiff looking modern chair as something that actually does fit a body that a worker, white collar worker can sit in and labor in. But what really struck me when I saw it, it's at the Getty, it's this tiny little photograph, is that it also is a kind of technology used in spirit photography, which was essential to a movement called Spiritism, or spiritualism. It was called one in the US and spiritualism in Europe, where they believed that the dead were all around us and that they could be made manifest through new technologies. And there were all of these, what were called the occult sciences in the later 19th century in Europe. Pictures were being shown around to show how spirits could manifest, for example, in ink blots, or how thought transfers could be made through drawings, that one person could concentrate on a picture and someone else in another room would make images that often did bear some kind of likeness to the picture the first person was concentrating on. But all of this was seen as scientific, as, akin to, say, the X-ray, which is revealing things that we knew were there, but we couldn't see before. And in 1927, there was a seance conducted in the Sorbonne as research. And this was not an outlier. So, taking that stance much more that the Bauhaus is weirder than we thought, and that spirituality and explorations of the soul could be something that were not so separate from the technological or the scientific, was sort of the basis of this chapter. You know what? I know why that is chiming, and I'm going to make it stop. Okay. Good. So there's this religion called Mazda's Nan that in the early Bauhaus, many of the students were practicing. It came with the Bauhaus master or teacher, Johannes Itten, who came with a bunch of students from Vienna and practiced this religion. And it was kind of a mishmash. It was made up by someone named Otto Hannisch, who was living in Chicago. He was probably a German immigrant. He said he was raised in the Himalayas by Zoroastrian monks, but there is no evidence of that. And it drew on theosophy, vegetarianism. It was very much kind of like a new age that we saw in the 90s, and a mixture of all kinds of faiths with some general ideas like go towards the light, think good thoughts, that kind of thing. But there were also people like Gertrud Grunau teaching at the school, who was really influential in the early years and has been totally written out of the school's history, who believed she was a composer, and she had this idea that color, movement, and sound all had equivalencies, and that basically the body as a perceiving organ could kind of cross them all. And if you were in harmony, that you would be able to dance the color blue, for example, or have movements that were part of a particular chord, musical chord. And we see even people like Jost Schmidt, who's remembered as a very kind of pragmatic, rational teacher during the late years of the Bauhaus, was teaching yoga and theories of the chakras all the way up until 1933. So, and also that people say like Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, who I show you here, who's really, he was brought in as the constructivist. They kept calling him the constructivist when he was being brought to the school in 1932, I think, or 22 rather. I think partially because they found his name difficult to say. But, you know, he also knew about Mazda's He was having his horoscope read. He was collecting palm prints. So, you know, the experiments and the directions that they go in are much more adventurous, I think, than had been seen before. So, yeah, I like this idea of you all working through reason and subversion as a pair, because it's, you know, it's not just reason and unreason, it's, you know, how to kind of overthrow the systems too, right? And that was something I was interested in doing.
Well, what I find interesting is that reason, or often people's conception of reason is often, I mean, if you go back to sort of people like Diderot, it goes, there's this way in which reason's often seen as something that's going to challenge the system that's gone before it. There is a way in which you could also see things like occultism and the exploration of things that seem beyond this as a kind of rational process. And it seems like the life reform movement could be itself seen as something that's very rational in some respects.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, a figure like Kandinsky, you know, believed that synesthesia, like that one should cultivate synesthesia, that if you could, you know, hear color, that you were sort of at another level of understanding and artistic ability. And he published on the spiritual and art. And this was, you know, that for students coming to the Bauhaus, that they could study with Kandinsky was like super mind-blowing. And so, yeah, I think they sort of felt like they were pioneers on the edge of a whole bunch of things. And they were, you know, spiritual as well as just kind of practical, but in a way that could be life-changing too, I think.
Yeah, it seems like they're really trying to create a new, or find a new way of living, I guess, is what especially what I get from your book. It's that sort of sense of not just designing things anew, but almost finding ways to live anew or experiment with how we live.
Yeah, and like free love was a part of it. You know, and it's part of why there was such a backlash to this school. I didn't say initially, but the school existed in 3 locations. Many of you may know this. It starts in Weimar, where the Archduke invites Gropius to come and create this new school. And it quickly becomes kind of a beacon that starts drawing students from throughout Europe and eventually from as far away as Japan, also from the US. But in its local context, Weimar is actually, you know, quite a small town that is really excited about Goethe still and the classical moment of literature in the 18th century and 19th century. And they saw this as kind of an abomination. And there were newspaper articles about, you know, how all the female students were getting pregnant, and everybody was, you know, not only not horrified, they were celebrating this, and, you know, everything was going to hell. And so they eventually got their funding pulled. And then the town of Dessau, which was, you know, a communist stronghold at that time, invited them in, gave them land to build this purpose-built building, gave them salaries for the teachers. But then they turned Nazi pretty early. I mean, 1932 was actually the best that the Nazi party ever did in the elections. And suddenly, you know, they'd been kind of being heckled by this right-wing group, and in 1932 it becomes the government for the most part in Dessau. So they're kicked out again, and then they're in Berlin just for 6 months. So, you know, I think the fact that they were pushing the envelope, they were pissing people off, I think, and you know, creating waves that drew exciting people to them, but also made them the subject of, well, they just had a lot of difficulty maintaining an institution because what they were doing was working, I think.
I think photography is like is one of the mediums that seems to permeate your book quite a lot. It strikes me that far from being kind of an example of like modern secular disenchantment, it seems that photography is sort of almost entirely enchanted, especially like even the examples that you were showing a minute ago with the sitting in the chair. It sort of seems laden with ghosts. So I was sort of wondering how you understand the relationship between Bauhaus sort of photography and ghosts.
Oh, and ghosts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Let's see. Let me just see what I brought in terms of images for that. I mean, photo, it's funny because, you know, it's an art and design school that also, you know, I mentioned Kandinsky taught there, Paul Klee taught there, so it's important for painting, but I've always been particularly drawn to the photography of the Bauhaus, and photography wasn't even officially taught there until 1928 when Walter Peterhans is brought in as an instructor, and it's taught as a part of the advertising workshop. So the workshops and the structure of the school changed frequently over time, but people were taking pictures. They had, often these Rolleiflex cameras. You can see them kind of looking down and taking them. Some of them came in already trained as photographers or taught each other. Lucia Maholi probably taught Florence Henry, who's one of the photographers who really interests me. And she was featured in the 1938 Bauhaus exhibition at MoMA that was curated by Walter Gropius, his wife Isa Gropius, and Herbert Bayer, who was a student and then a teacher at the Bauhaus before he became an advertiser in Berlin. So, everybody knew that photography was really important to the Bauhaus. Florence Henry learned it there when she was just auditing, and there was no official photography workshop there, but she was kind of converted to this medium at the Bauhaus, and it became important for her. And this is maybe a good example of what you're talking about as it being kind of, both kind of ghostly in a way, because Florence Henry was, she had a really extraordinary life, and I think she's starting to be better known. I think she should be even better known because she's just, her photos are so gorgeous. But there, this is so rectilinear and architectural and structural and modern, right? With these machined balls here and the perfect mirror, and I guess these are boards joined together here along a wall. But, its actual subject, who we see looking out kind of to the side of the picture, is absent in the main space of the photograph, right? So it's totally destabilizing in a way, and she's both there and not there. And I'm interested in this as, her kind of imaging in some ways the impossibility of showing lesbian subjectivity at this moment, that she's, both there and not there. Rosalind Krauss wrote about this maybe in the 80s, in an essay called Jump Over the Bauhaus. And she, who I don't think of as making crude jokes, talks about this as her giving herself balls, which, I think that's legit, but it's also kind of about, same pairings of sames and reflecting that back, we can see this as kind of a technologized queer moment in the photograph, I think, too. So yeah, I'm interested in the photographs that Bauhaus members take that show their friendships that aren't necessarily otherwise memorialized in the structure of the institution, but we know who they hung out with because they took, I don't know if this is a selfie, but it sort of looks like a selfie. They took photos together, they hung out together. There are casual photographs of them, and they also just used them to experiment and kind of push the boundaries of what could or could not be imaged. This, in my Queer Bauhaus chapter, I talk about as, another kind of ghostly image. It's also technological experiments that are typical of the Bauhaus, to include like glass and metal reflective. It's in a Bauhaus interior. This is one of the rooms in the Preller house or dormitory wing of the Bauhaus, but it's also, about queer desire that is both present and absent, and that's, very much there in this gesture of tenderness between men and the interweaving of their figures in an ambiguous way. But one figure is ghostly and he's contained at the same time. Even though photography is kind of always peripheral in the Bauhaus, I think it's also always kind of gazing in and gives us a way to look back. And because of my interest in the Bauhaus as a life experiment, photography allows us to, I would never say it's documenting the bodies, or that it's, of course, art historians, we're not supposed to talk about photos as windows because they're always composed, but it does give us a kind of, that indexical quality of photography that this was there, is very powerful and allows us, I think, to see more about the institution when we look to that. So does that make sense?
I suppose it puts the actual subjects, or the people that are making these pieces of work within the actual artwork, so that they're situated there, and you get the bits of their life coming in.
And I try to do that with other things too, like in the Queer Bauhaus chapter, to talk about so here's Max Pfeiffer-Wattenpohl together with his good friend Florence Henry. Max Pfeiffer-Wattenpohl came to the school in 1919 and was gay. So like I have documented a gay presence at the school from the start, even though there's no evidence that it was a particularly gay-friendly or queer-friendly institution at all. But, it was an art school that drew interesting young people. So of course there were queer people there. So he was there in 1919. I was interested in thinking about queer identity and queer practice beyond simply appearance and bodies. As I mentioned before, the weaving workshop was this place that women were encouraged to go. There were a few male students, but it's where over a quarter of all women at the Bauhaus went. I think there were just 128, and there were 430 some women at the Bauhaus. And Max Pfeiffer-Wattenpohl goes, and he had this special permission because he was already a trained painter to just work in different workshops for a while and try things out. And he went and made this really cool rug. And Vasily Kandinsky liked it so much, he asked for a copy. And only one of these survives. And Max Pfeiffer-Wattenpohl himself didn't know whether the one that survived, he couldn't tell anymore if it was the original or the copy. But I talk about this as a kind of queer coded object, as something that is a kind of medium drag almost, because this was coded as femininity. And as a gay man at the Bauhaus, I think he may have allowed himself, this kind of moment of performative crossing into what was seen as feminized space. So I'm interested in putting the objects in dialogue with photography, because photographs like this by Max Pfeiffer-Wattenpohl, the queer content is much clearer, right? It's this beautiful young man. There's no camp really here. It's just an image of desire, and seems really to be a kind of prelude to a sexual encounter. I was in the archive when this came out on a rolling cart, and I was like, whoa. So or images like this that are really pretty campy. I think all of those allow us to tap into fragments of a queer Bauhaus. And to be clear, male homosexuality was criminalized and outlawed in Germany at this time, even though Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Science was in the capital doing all this research into sort of a celebrating of the diversity of human sexuality and sexual identity. So there's this kind of repression and openness in the culture that I was looking for in the art that was there. And photography helped me to do that, but I also, wanted to say that objects did too.
The book presents sort of Bauhaus as a sort of multidisciplinary movement that crosses over into multiple mediums. So rather than just simply focusing on architecture, design, and painting, you take us into a world of ballet, photography, photo montage, film, and even music, as well as sort of gymnastics, yoga, spiritual training. To what extent was this broader curriculum and sort of broader interests connected to a sort of broader or larger Bauhaus vision?
Yeah, so in the manifesto, it's called the Bauhaus Manifesto. It was just kind of a statement that Gropius read out. As far as I know, it was certainly printed and distributed on April 1st in 1919. He talks about bringing together all the arts to do away with the arrogant barrier between art and craft, and to unite the arts to create kind of a new future. And he compares the outcome of this to the cathedral. So it's actually a kind of totally retro model that he puts out there. But what he's evoking is the way that all different kinds of creative people can work together to create a total work of art. And the cathedral is certainly one that most people could have called to mind as a place that's just everything is designed to a certain extent, if we want to use that term retroactively. There's an interest in everybody working together and in creating together and doing big projects together. And that was something that happened pretty early on. So a man called Adolf Sommerfeld was one of the early sponsors of the Bauhaus, and they all designed a villa for him in Berlin, and it was hit by a bomb in World War II, but the garage is still standing there. Apparently whoever owns it doesn't like visitors, and it's kind of been messed up. But this included furniture, stained glass that was designed by Joseph Alpers, furniture by Marcel Breuer. They were both students at the time. A large structure that was designed by Walter Gropius in collaboration with other people. But the idea that all of this would come from a new understanding of life and what the purpose of creative people were was also inherent in that first manifesto, and in the way Gropius calls young people to come and work together. And things like the naked gymnastics that you mentioned earlier, or this kind of harmonization theory was essential to the school. And Gropius himself participated in some of this training. And Gertrude Grunau, okay, let me just back up a little. I'm trying to talk about several things at once. Johannes Itten was brought in to teach what was called the basic course or the preliminary course. And the idea, it won't sound that strange to you. And that's because, the Bauhaus has been so influential in terms of how we do art school. The idea was to kind of break down preconceived notions. And he would say, before you can draw a tiger, you have to move like a tiger, or they would just do movements or sing or, learn about this new religion, for example, or make texture boards in other iterations of this, go around and pick up trash and make something out of it. So the idea was to get away from conventional skill sets and ideas of beauty in order to create creative people who could kind of take on any challenge of the world. And, again, with the background of World War I behind all of this, I think that was just incredibly life-changing in terms of thinking, okay, art, making paintings for wealthy people is not that meaningful. What are creative people going to do to help build a new and better society? And they weren't overtly talking about pacifism that much, but it's certainly implicit in there, and internationalism, I think. So Johannes Itten was teaching these ideas. Grunau was teaching her harmonization theory. Students would make these color boards and talk about, do these movements with her. And she was so important that her assessment was crucial before students were considered ready to move on from the preliminary course. They all had to do at least a semester. Sometimes they had to do 2. And then she would say, okay, this person's ready for workshop specialization, which is when they would, for example, like Marcel Breuer, go into the woodworking workshop and learn how to make furniture. Or like Marianne Brandt, there was the metal workshop, those kinds of things where you actually take on technical skills. I think thinking about a broader Bauhaus vision of making creative people and contributing to society, kind of trying to figure out how to anticipate society's needs, maybe even before it does, was essential to the school. And it's part of why, they make practical objects that I showed you some examples of, the chairs, but they also make, I don't know if I have any examples here. I think I don't. Well, here, I can show you this on my desk. They made lights. So this is a Marianne Brandt design light. Can you see it? I don't know if it's, so they worked with a lighting company, and they had all different kinds of tools to see where the light is being cast, how many lumens it has, how strong it is. And they were, this is as a lot of the country's still not on the grid and needs lights. And a lot of lights are being made, like you probably can't see them, but like the ones behind me, like fake candles. And they're saying like, no, we're not going to do that. So, it's kind of mundane, but I think that they were interested in, anticipating what society needed and providing it in an efficient way. But this was much more than just like good product design. It was about, making life easy, freeing people from old possessions and old ways of thinking. That's what I
think. To think of it almost like building a cathedral or having, because it's got that spiritual side as well, and those two elements going on.
Right, incredibly practical, but it's going to spiritually elevate you.
Yeah, I've just got a question, not so much what you just talked about, but more earlier when you were talking about queerness in the Bauhaus within the context of criminalization. I read a book recently about like gay shame, and it was talking about how the criminalization of homosexuality and those kinds of things has kind of, in some sort of sense, led to this kind of queer sensibility of liking art and design and all of these things. So I'm just wondering, like, what's your take on how maybe the criminalization of homosexuality and queerness influenced queer art at the time and perhaps influences queer art today? And I guess, especially in the Bauhaus.
Yeah, I just taught a class on fashion, and there's been work on how, in relation to design, fashion, like, there's a sort of much more open queer space for fashion design, but how that hierarchy, works and why it works in this field that in some ways was considered a marginal creative field. In 1919, the first gay rights film comes out called Different from the Others, which Magnus Hirschfeld worked on. That's Magnus Hirschfeld there. I hope you can see my cursor, but he's the one on the right. And this was part of what were called a series of Aufklärungsfilme, or Enlightenment films, literally translated, where the makers of these films, particularly Richard Oswald, were interested in taking on problems in society of the day. So they also made one on, arguing that conjugal visits should be a part of prison, like as a part of prison reform. But this one was particularly groundbreaking because paragraph 175 was a law that had been a part of the German penal code since the 19th century. And it meant that what was actually going on was not just shaming, but blackmailing. So there was this huge problem with blackmail during the Weimar Republic. And this led to suicide, so that people who were or were not gay were being taken into court publicly and shamed for this, or being threatened with this and needing to pay huge sums of money. So this film, which has survived only as a fragment, but you can see it in the internet, shows a love story, shows this creative musician who falls in love with one of his proteges and is being blackmailed by a former lover and ends up dying. But it features scenes, it's kind of absurd because it's a silent film, but so it features these long scenes where Magnus Hirschfeld is talking to the main character played by Konrad Veidt, who the same year was the sleepwalker in the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, if you've seen that, he's the scary guy. And he's explaining, that same-sex desire is natural, not even limited to the human species, all kinds of scientific evidence to create a broader argument for a lay audience that, it is wrong to criminalize male same-sex desire. Yeah, so to return to your question, correct me if I'm not getting to all of your question. I think looking at queer aspects of the Bauhaus was really important, just as a kind of archaeology in a way, to sort of see who was there and what they were, how images of same-sex desire came out in the Bauhaus. Or actually in one of the cases, I was interested in a particular designer who I call a queer singleton. There's a tendency when we look back in history where we can't identify a partner, and someone seems in a way to have been sort of stridently covering over their private life. We tend to ascribe, say, oh, that person was probably gay or lesbian. And with this particular artist, Margaret Leiteritz, I found images of naked women together. They're not having sex with each other. They're not, if they're looking at each other, it sort of seems to be kind of these very strained and strange interactions. But there was enough there that I was starting to think like, this seems about same-sex desire or ambivalences around it. But I also was finding these images in a book that she did of Cupid and Psyche, where instead of, the traditional image of these star-crossed lovers who are kept apart by cruel gods, she's showing this woman alone a lot, and her kind of diving off into the future, and she made statements in a job application. She was an archivist, so she really curated what we do have and don't have of her work and of her life. But she made a statement in a job application once saying, I am single and without attachment, and I will be able to move to Karlsruhe to take up this job. So I decided to think of her as a queer singleton, as someone who, overtly chose a non-traditional lifestyle, especially, during the Nazi period when there was this huge pressure on women to, actually marriage was optional, but to bear children, which she did not do. So, I was thinking about queerness, I guess, in that sense too. And I think if the last part of your question that I retained is in terms of influence on other people. I think especially Florence Henry, because her work circulated the most of the queer artists that I look into or that I focus on. This, for example, was published in a pretty mainstream French magazine. Do you all call it Page 3? Is that right? I mean, it was
some we've got in the UK, yeah.
Yeah, it's like a TNA magazine. And, it said on the cover, like, many lively pictures, but other avant-garde photographers, including Germaine Krall, were showing their work in this context. So her work was maybe circulating the most, and I think did influence other people. She also taught Ilse Bing and a number of important photographers. So in that sense, I think she had a broader impact. Pfeiffer Wattenpool, there's still more work to do, I think, in terms of tracing out his connections, but he was certainly a part of circles of gay men in Italy that, were friends, and some of them probably lovers, and working together, showing each other art. So, I'd say there's influence sometimes in more private spheres and then sometimes more publicly. Does that answer your question? Feel free to, because you said several things at once and I jotted down what I could, but if there's more you'd like to know, I'm happy to answer.
Oh yeah, I think that was really interesting. Thank you. I think it was also just interesting to know, I mean, it's not so much a question or anything, but it's just interesting how you briefly spoke about like blackmailing. And yeah, I think I just remembered learning at some point that like in the Cold War, there was a lot of British spies that were being blackmailed by like the Soviets essentially because they were gay. And that was like part of the motivation to decriminalize homosexuality essentially, so that something like that couldn't happen. So it's almost like it didn't come about to us because they wanted to give us rights, but because that was what was convenient for the British government at the time.
Yeah, right. Here we call that the Lavender Scare, right? Where there's this real fear during the Cold War of homosexuality, and that it's politicized in another different way. And I just wanted to point out, because I've talked more about the laws around male homosexuality. So female homosexuality wasn't overtly criminalized, but it was, which has to do with ideas about women and sex, right? That like there isn't that much going on, I guess, and according to patriarchs. But certainly it was kind of on the down low, but also being researched by Magnus Hirschfeld, and also a part of this really lively kind of blossoming of queer culture in Weimar Germany that was legendary and drawing people, from the UK and further abroad. And I just show you here an image of the formidable Lotte Hamm, who ran the women's club Violetta. And I love this because it says this Sunday, women's ball and cream puff eating contest, which sounds sort of naughty and fun. I include this image too, because some of what I found a lot of times this is still continuing on in my research, but, I find text bits for where there's no image. So I did find an application by a student who described his qualifications, his background, his art studies, and certainly seemed to have enough training that he would have been taken in the Bauhaus. But then at the end of this letter, they call it a CV in German, but it's just kind of a letter describing things. He says, since last fall, I have permission from the police to wear men's clothing. I am, taking advantage of this, and signs it Hans/Johanna. So this is someone who was born female and who we would call a trans man now. And that person was not admitted. And there are no notes that have survived in the folders about why, which is, it's not uncommon that files are incomplete. But I think it was, queer transphobia in the institution. And that's why that person was not admitted, because there's no other reason. They actually needed students, and the person was qualified. So so I think for a lot of institutions and countries, I do not need to say, just to follow up, I guess, on what you said, that it's kind of what's convenient and, where they allow queer spaces to exist versus where rather, really encouraging them. So I was interested in finding a queer Bauhaus kind of despite the Bauhaus.
Yeah, because one of the things that's really interesting about your book is that it does go into the students quite a lot and actually looks at the Bauhaus as a whole rather than simply Bauhaus as the sort of main figures that we're meant to sort of think about.
Right. And in the introduction, I talk about the idea of the Bauhäusler, which was something Germany at the time was very hierarchical, and the language still, retains what we've lost in English, which I find a total relief, a formal versus an informal you. And so it's kind of extraordinary that they had this idea of a Bauhäusler, and anyone who was at the school at all in any capacity was a Bauhäusler, whether you were the head of the school or, somebody who came by like Florence Henry and audited there for a semester while you picked up your girlfriend who was a weaver there. And, so it has this really egalitarian side to it and inclusive, I think. So I was interested in taking the students much more seriously, I think. And that also allowed, because it was still sexist and hierarchical, that allows us to bring more women into it. There were women who had leadership positions, but they were almost always qualified and sort of fraught to a certain extent.
So in a manner that sort of parallels Russian constructivism, sort of Bauhaus artists seem to be exploring ideas of the worker as producer. This imagined worker tends to be a sort of male worker, and you explore how this sort of aestheticization of productive labor produces new models of sort of masculinity, whilst being kind of accompanied by anxieties around masculinity emerging from the First World War. How should we understand this new masculinity or new masculinities, and how was it different from sort of prior or concurrent variants of masculinity?
Yeah, I find masculinity weird and interesting. So it's something I always sort of have a bit of a radar for. And the Bauhaus was certainly not alone in trying to create new models of what an artist should do. We see this quite clearly in constructivism as well. And, figures there designing, like Rodchenko designing a kind of suit that's, kind of like a worker's coverall, but it's covered in pockets so he can have all his stuff on him all the time. And this image, which Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, who came in to take over the preliminary course as Itin was kind of being ushered out, and as the school is turning from expressionism to constructivism, he asks his wife, as far as I can tell, Lucia Moholy, to take this photograph of him. And he's wearing coveralls, which Robin Schuldenfrei has done research on them. And I think, if I'm remembering correctly, they're orange. At one point she told me they were red, but I think they're orange. So he has this kind of mechanic suit. It might be a French fisherman suit, but something that, let me see if I can enlarge this for you. He can wear his suit and tie under, so he's a bit of a white collar worker, but he also, can paint, can get grubby. When he's teaching the students, can use materials. And I see him here as really embodying this artist engineer figure, as I call it. We can also call it an artist constructor, who is, much more of a thinker than as much as a doer, I guess. He was interested in thinking about light as the new medium of the future. He painted a lot, but he said he only did this because light technology was not strong enough to create the kinds of experiences or like experiential spaces that he wanted to create through colored light. He was interested, he wrote about creating essentially what sounds a lot like television. It's before television is created, but something that'll transmit abstract light experiences into every home that people could watch. He's interested in sound recording, but again, not necessarily to just, he's against reproduction. He doesn't just want sound recordings that play Mozart over again, but that are themselves productive, that create brand new experiences. So they might just be different kinds of noises, or it might be the sound of the material with the needle on a record rather than music being reproduced. So he's got all these like really lofty ideals, and he's not the only one at the Bauhaus. But what interested me is in his work, and he's not the only one, but this I think is a good example, even as he's creating himself as this kind of steely, brilliant engineer figure, he's taking this same photograph and like totally making fun of himself. So this is one of at least 3 photo montages where he does things like, let me just move this over, prints it in negative and then cuts out his inner figure here so that it's just empty and gives it like these dainty ladies' feet. Or he does, he does an ink wash to create the figure again here. And it's pierced through the heart by a female sharpshooter. And here, here's the negative image with the feet, just kind of this weird lurking thing. So it's called jealousy. And it to me, it's about desire, about sexuality, about masculinity that is undercut in so many ways, and just, mocking himself in many different ways. There's another version, which I translate as the chump. It's der Trottel, where he, again shows himself as his body kind of not fitting into this series of cutouts, or, limbs kind of flying around. And what struck me, what I argue is going on in these images is a kind of preparing, keeping this masculinity in check, because parallel to the Bauhaus, we also have Germany's right wing continuing to exist in the Free Corps and coalescing around the rising National Socialist movement. And these kinds of steely, muscly, impermeable masculinities will be, of course, celebrated once Germany becomes a National Socialist state from 1933 on. So here's a work by Joseph Torak, who's one of several sculptors who celebrate the male body in these totally homosocial contexts, even though by this point, Nazism is a completely homophobic and anti-homosexual movement. Early on, that's unclear actually in Nazism, because the SA is a very pro-gay, even though it's Nazi organization. So this kind of celebration of masculinity as armed and tough, even when it's a completely naked body, is something that I think Bauhaus men like Moholy-Nagy, and I show a number of examples of this, are trying to protect against, even as they're trying to create themselves anew and give themselves and other artists like a whole new purview in which to create and play. They're kind of guarding against any attempt to make themselves seem godlike or as ideals, or as these tough men that should be worshipped, and they're reacting, I think, to the context in which they're working.
Wondering, sorry if you feel like you've already covered this. I've recently taken an interest, especially in kind of like these modern internet groups, about how the right And also, this is kind of what I wrote my dissertation on. So, like, basically, I mean, I'll just give you the example of my dissertation. My dissertation was on Austrian Freedom Party or something. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but there's this kind of tendency on the right, and especially within that party, to represent their leaders as, like, you know, beautiful and masculine and muscular. And, you know, my main theory around this is that because they're so, like, basically afraid of essentially immigrants and, you know, feminism, etc., that they kind of feel like they need these kind of big, beautiful, muscular men to lead their movement. So, yeah, I'm just kind of wondering, like, what your take on that is, and if you think this kind of influences any of the Bauhaus movement at all, like, yeah, this slide that you're showing on screen.
Yeah, so just to be clear, I see Bauhaus masculinities as really reacting against this. And the Austrian Freedom Party, I mean, in general, I think we see in hard right and neo-Nazi groups, a lot of times, you know, they're doing this again, right? They want to celebrate these kinds of masculinities, but they're also sending, like, barely coded messages by particularly picking up on the iconography of Nazism. So, you know, these kinds of, you know, Arno Brecker is another, you know, incredibly celebrated sculptor of under the Third Reich, who became extremely wealthy. And a lot of his, if you Google him, I mean, they're like a lot of his soldiers images or, you know, he does like war, and they're also huge, you know, just really, really huge. Because he had state sponsorship, but it's like literally an outsized masculinity. So I would think what's going on with the Freedom Party, I haven't looked at their imagery specifically, but what you're describing is, you know, very much a, you know, what's it called, a dog whistle? I mean, it's really saying, like, you know, this is what this is really about. And also I would agree with what you're saying, that in both cases, it's, you know, celebrating blood and soil, Germanic masculinities, and trying to present them as impermeable, trying to create this, you know, as if this was a kind of timeless thing that's being attacked, whereas, like, it's, you know, it's all bullshit, right? Like, it's all bullshit that there is this one timeless Germanic identity. You know, we know, like, if you look at Germany and Austria, right, like, the borders are changing all the time, and, like, cultural groups have been coming and going for forever. Like, all the cities have an east-west access because of the incredibly old trade routes. So, you know, I think it's particularly when people are trying to prop up a fiction that they tend to go to a real extreme. And so I think that's attractive to people, again, to create this kind of imagery and celebrate it and say, you know, this is what's really under threat, instead of, like, you know, these poor people who actually just want to be at home, but, you know, their homes are being destroyed right now, so they need to go someplace else. And so for the Bauhaus, you know, I think the Austrian Freedom Party didn't. I know that wasn't your question, but I think being aware, you know, a lot of what I'm doing is situating the Bauhaus in culture, and so to say these kind of, I mean, he used this sometimes as, like, his identity card picture, right? He just cut out a head of it because his wife could print as many versions of it as he wanted. And these are, you know, playful images, but to me, I really wanted to unpack why this particular kind of creativity, why this image of the self, or, you know, I don't have the slide here, but Herbert Bayer was making similar images of Walter Gropius, who was kind of a father figure to him. He was also having an affair with his wife. Herbert Bayer was. So, you know, I'm interested in kind of what's going on behind the scenes interpersonally, but also why they're making these particularly unusual images of male leaders in this institution, that they're both kind of taking on leadership, but also, you know, stepping back from it and showing themselves as valuable at the same time.
So in your chapter on Bauhaus Femininities in Transformation, you explore the photography of Mariana Brent and Gertrude Acht. I apologize if my pronunciation is terrible in some of these. But what really sort of struck me was how, especially with Brent's studio in a ball, which was 1928 or 1929. I was struck by like how it was hard to sort of historically place because it felt really, really contemporary. So I was sort of wondering in what respect were femininities in flux during this period, and to what extent have they sort of influenced the world we live in today?
This chapter on Bauhaus Femininities, I start with this image, which actually isn't a photograph, but it's made by a photographer and filmmaker, Bauhaus, one of the things, especially if you work on women, is they tend to change their names a lot. So she came to the Bauhaus named Erna Niemeyer, but I call her Resupo because that's the name she used for the longest period in her adult life. She was also Renate Richter Green, and she was trained as a weaver. She was also a fashion designer and, as I mentioned, photographer and filmmaker. So in Die Form, which was a really important design journal in Germany, it was the house journal of the Werkbund, she showed these images of what she called the transformation dress, which was, one basic dress that could be made into 13 different outfits with, a few pieces that would just come with it. And because I'd worked on this book that I showed you early on, Bauhaus Women, I kind of, in my mind, I had already a different Bauhaus behind me. So I didn't just want to write a chapter and be like, hey, there were women at the Bauhaus. I wanted to try to identify something that I thought particularly they were working on. And a lot of this is kind of multifunctional or transformable design. So that's kind of the context of this chapter. And certainly women weren't the only ones doing it, but many of them, seemed particularly interested in that, working, here's Friedel Dicker working together with Franz Singer. They made this toy set that's basically Legos before Legos. Or they were interested in small spaces, like making convertible small spaces that could serve a whole bunch of purposes in an urban context. They're doing that, but they also, the years to come for them during the crises of the Weimar Republic, the Great Depression, the rise of Nazism, they seemed even more vulnerable than many of their male compatriots to the difficulties. And so they end up doing things like, just taking this example of Friedel Dicker, she made anti-Nazi, anti-right-wing propaganda. She stopped being a designer and sort of dedicated herself to this. She became a communist. And she ends up in Theresienstadt concentration camp and teaches Bauhaus methods to over 500 students who are in the concentration camp and ghetto. So whenever you see images coming out of Theresienstadt, those are her students. Those are Bauhaus methods, where she's using a kind of proto-art therapy. So thinking about that, then I turned to photography in the last part of the chapter. And I agree with you that there is a kind of modernity or almost timelessness to these images. Kathleen James Chakraborty wrote on Bauhaus women's fashion and how weirdly contemporary it feels in the Bauhaus Bodies book that I showed you guys earlier on. So she's, reading her work and editing her work certainly influenced me in thinking about this. And I think part of it is that ready to wear is coming online, that there's also a new kind of set of roles that these women are stepping into that are familiar now. So they're designers. Mariana Brandt is a metal designer. She's the one who did the tea extract pot that I showed you, the little metal one. But she also took photographs and seems to be exploring her own image right as she's taking on leadership in the Bauhaus. She became the acting head of the metal workshop when Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, who was her mentor, left. And she uses this metal ball here to reflect herself back. And, right as she seems to be taking on leadership, to be making herself diminutive. In this image, they're so small. Luckily, they're easy to blow up. So here I've just blown up a piece of it. I was like, what is she doing? And you can see she's all by herself in her Bauhaus studio, posing. I've not seen many images of her dressed very femininely at all. But here she's in this white dress. She's wearing stockings and high heels. She's done her hair up. And she's all by herself, posing kind of as this Bauhaus babe. And she has the Bauhaus house journal Next to her, it's actually an issue where she published an essay about how, they use these really scientific approaches to design under her leadership in the metal workshop. I was thinking about, I think it's in this chapter, I was thinking about how they are kind of transforming themselves as well into designers, into, women in a kind of man's world where they might play kind of impish or sexy. What I end up writing about in relation to these images is Joan Riviere, who was British and was a translator of Freud, was psychoanalyzed by Freud. She wrote about femininity as a masquerade, right? This same year, she published it in 1929, where she was seeing a number of her female friends who had entered into male professions and seemed to have these moments of really showing themselves in hyper-feminized ways, almost to signal that they weren't a threat, she argues. But I also talk about Gertrude Arndt, who was a weaver, and a really accomplished weaver. She was in this colorized, hand-colored image of Walter Gropius's office, the main office of the director in the Weimar Bauhaus. This is her rug on the bottom. But in 1927, she passes her test to become a journeyman weaver, and she passes, and she decides she's never going to weave again because she doesn't feel like it. She actually had gone to the Bauhaus to become an architect, and was one of those who was pushed into the weaving workshop. When she comes back to the Bauhaus, she marries a fellow student who is asked later to come back and teach there. Instead of helping out in the weaving workshop, which she easily could have done, she starts making these photographs alone, like Marianne Brandt. Also on the campus of the Bauhaus, they're living in one of the master's houses that were designed by Gropius. And she covers herself in fabric often, which was her former medium, and takes these really weird photographs that she calls mask photos, but none of them have masks in them. And they seem to kind of gesture to the past, almost Victorian, or here, I think she looks a little like Mae West before Mae West. But there's no kind of serious investigation into costuming or trying to appear like she's from another era. So, in this, I see this costuming and dressing up as a kind of renunciation of the Bauhaus's orientation towards the future. I call it, drawing on queer theory. We can think of it as a kind of doing, like pushing against futurity, this institution that's interested in creating a better future and creating, well-designed objects for everybody. She just says like, no, and creates these images that are in a way almost a kind of dead end. The timelessness of images like this that show a female designer as kind of androgynous, kind of fitting into a man's world, does kind of resonate still today, that there's this kind of play with presentation and gender that I think female designers still have to do much more than men. Recently, a colleague of mine who's in history, which is fashion-wise seen as kind of a boring academic realm, he said he has yet to be on a jobs committee where they're hiring someone where the female candidates, someone always comments on what they're wearing, and almost never do they comment on the male candidates' clothing. So I think it's very much a thing still.
How we comment on gender, some of these things still apply, I suppose, as well in that context.
Yeah, and I should say, the Bauhaus was also known for throwing fantastic parties. It's one of the ways they made money. Mm-hmm. And often, as like all college parties, there are tons of men who are otherwise pretty cis, who, showed up in drag of some kind, or, they'd show up like in a military costume where they had like forks and spoons instead of, so it was a very carnivalesque atmosphere with a lot of different kinds of play and crossing, but certainly gender play was a part of that.
So in a recent article for October magazine on Ringel and Pitt, you evoke Jack Hamberstam's account of the queer art of failure, whereby failure allows us to escape the punishing norms that discipline behavior and manage human development, and also preserve some of the wondrous anarchy of childhood and disturb the supposed clean boundaries between adults and children, winners and losers. So some of the pieces you present in the chapter on queer Bauhaus, each in some way seems to challenge norms that discipline society around them. So a lot of this can seem really playful, but I was also struck by how dark and ambivalent some of these pieces were, especially Richard Grune's Rack. I was wondering how you understand the relationship between, I suppose, those three things, failure, play, but also the sort of ambivalence around desire, I guess.
Yeah, I didn't. So Ringel and Pitt, let me see if you know what, I'm not going to change PowerPoints. I didn't bring the Ringel and Pitt images, although I could pull them up if anyone particularly wants to see them. But I was thinking about Jack Haberstam also with these images, with the kind of, Jack says queers are sort of masters of failure in some ways, of not playing along in a way, in a kind of playful way. And, Jack is talking about films like Dude, Where's My Car, in an essay called Dude, Where's My Phallus. I have to say, I really recommend that. It's fun. But this was helpful also for me for thinking about Gertrude Arndt, as I alluded to before, in terms of not embracing the mission of the Bauhaus, kind of, opting to fail and kind of do so somewhat spectacularly with these images that I find really kind of haunting and great. So Richard Grune, though, he's from Kiel in Germany, and there's someone there, I don't remember his name off the top of my head, but he's been doing more, I think, to remember him. But he was a Bauhaus artist he was one of those who took the preliminary course twice. And at the end of it, Gertrude Grunau, in the minutes of the Masters Council, wrote specifically, she wrote that basically she thought he was in the process of discovering something about himself. And once he did, that he would be freer as an artist. And we have no idea what she meant by that, but it sounds a lot like a teacher perhaps observing a young person struggling with coming out in a homophobic society. That is one plausible interpretation. And most definitely Richard Grune was gay. He left the Bauhaus then after not getting to specialize in a workshop, so he was there for a year, and went on to become a graphic designer and did projects like this, which was a really special book that came out of an autonomous children's socialist summer camp that happened in 1927 and was apparently just life-changing for any of the kids who participated in it. And Richard Grune and Niels Broodsen worked as graphic designers and photographers with the kids then to create this book. And this is actually a scan of my copy, and my copy, like many of them, have dedications. They were often then given from one person who was there to another, saying like, remembering our children's republic. And, it was like a little mini utopia for a summer. So he did stuff like this. When the Nazis came to power, like several Bauhaus members, he worked on anti-Nazi journals or underground newspapers, flyers. This stuff hasn't survived, so I just read about descriptions of it, but that sort of thing. And he was arrested in 1933 or 34, early on. And it was not, though, for this anti-Nazi activity. It was specifically because he was denounced for having a loud gay party. That was what was in the record, in quotes. And so it was specifically under the terms of paragraph 175, which remained on the books under Nazism. As I mentioned before, it was very spottily enforced during the period that the SA was also, Ernst Röhm, the head of it, a good friend of Hitler's, was out. More or less, this was brought up in newspapers and discussed, and it was discussed. Richard Grune is imprisoned. Eventually, he's transferred to a concentration camp. And when that happened to anyone, there was no longer a sentencing process in place. You were just there with no knowledge of when you'd get out. And in fact, he was in concentration camps until 1945, when he managed to break away from a death march. Because he was there under the pink triangle, once that system of coding prisoners was introduced, he was never compensated or given reparations by the state. All of his work was destroyed, other than printed publications, as far as we know. And, it was just really awful. He lived into the 80s. His story mostly wasn't told that much. And he was kind of a broken person, as far as I can tell. But he did use his skills as an artist that, draw to a certain extent on his training at the Bauhaus to create this series of lithographs. And a number of them just kind of show life in the camp. But one of them in particular that I talk about shows a flogging on what was called the rack. And it's particularly interesting, I think, because it does, and I'm not the only one to comment on this, but it looks like a kind of gang rape. It looks almost like sort of Tom of Finland imagery, yet it's, also this real image of his suffering that was not being recognized. And he creates this series as not just drawings that he did privately, but as lithographs. It can be reproduced and sent out to multiple people and shown widely as a way of sort of saying, like, this is what I suffered. And a scholar of the concentration camps once, when I showed this, said in particular, this form of torture was reserved for non-Jewish prisoners in particular, that it was this kind of flogging on the rack, or the buck, as it was called, was specifically not something that was connected to the genocidal anti-Semitism of the institutions, but of non-Jewish prisoners. So it has these documentary qualities to it. It has this kind of, it's this sexual undertone to it. But I just think it's an incredibly important image for thinking about where Bauhaus members go and where their art goes, and what it shows us if we're attentive to it, if we look at it and give it our attention. So I think that's what I would say about queer failures. Some of it I think is the artist embracing failure, and some of it is maybe in a way failing at Bauhaus, but going on to become these really interesting designers who then also suffer at the hands of the next regime and use their art as a way to try to communicate the incredibly complicated nature of their experiences.
Because I find this one brings up so many complex, so many different types of emotions that it's even hard to sort of think through how to think about it, really, I guess.
Yeah, I agree, which is part of why I wanted to reproduce it in my book, to say, like, this is Bauhaus too. It's not just foldable chairs, and to me, this means, I like a good foldable chair, but this means a lot, the complexities he's showing here, I think, and the violence, and just, it's just heartbreaking too, and I think, the heartbreak that people suffered is something I wanted to talk about, or being physically broken as well.
Yeah, well, I suppose it brings in emotions, it brings in desires, it brings in a whole range of human experiences that we can sometimes lose if you're just looking at chairs or some other elements. But they tell stories, I guess.
Yeah, and it maybe brings it back to the chairs. One time at the start of the Bauhaus year, I gave a talk at Bowdoin College, and this woman came up to me and introduced herself. And it turns out both of her grandparents, I think, were at the Bauhaus, and they were communists. And the man one of the things they left with were actually these folding chairs that he designed and as a gift for his wife. And she had one, and they had a small exhibition. And so I said to the curator, you might want to get a plinth out, because there's this cool chair. So I think, if we put all this diversity of expression back into the design, and then it's behind the design, we can see that chair as, something that Jewish refugees who were communists also took with them, that meant a lot to them, that maybe actually gave them a seat someplace where they had to wait interminably long to get into a new place, to get to safety, so to me then, I just said folding chair off the top of my head as an example of boring design, but I think, it's exciting design that's doing stuff that we sometimes haven't had the chance to see.
It's putting it back into context, isn't it?
Yeah.
I suppose that in some ways leads on to my next question. So in your final chapter, you note that in some ways, Bauhaus communism seems the logical outcome of the utopian seeking that motivated it from the start. So how did sort of communist and Marxist wings of the Bauhaus grow out of the Bauhaus movement? And in what ways did Bauhaus communism continue to develop?
Yeah, sure. I mean, thinking about it as a life reform, I see the institution making a transition that I think a lot of people in Germany and in Europe at this time made, maybe to a certain extent also globally, of kind of going from the individual, the spiritual, the self, into really having aspirations that are political, very specifically political. So this chapter, the last chapter of the Bauhaus, is called Red Bauhaus, Brown Bauhaus, red for communism, brown for Nazism. And I think because of that Cold War context that we were chatting about a bit earlier, there has been a story told, maybe it's particularly in North America, but I think in general, of the Bauhaus as apolitical. I think Gropius was quite interested in doing that. And that MoMA show that I mentioned in 1938, even though, the Bauhaus was over, that show was specifically Bauhaus 1919 to 1928, which is the period when Gropius is the director. So, in some ways it probably speaks to the objects they were able to get, but it's also kind of making the claim that that's the real Bauhaus, and that once Hannes Meyer, the second director, comes in, who was much more of a kind of communist thinker and interested in very practical design, that's not the real Bauhaus. So in this chapter, I try to say no. A politicized Bauhaus is just as Bauhaus as everything else. And that in some ways, this is kind of the life experiment writ large. And so the Great Depression happens in 1929, there's been this increasing polarization of politics, radicalization of the people during this time. And a lot of Bauhaus members, starting around in the mid-20s, start to be interested, particularly in the Communist Party, but as I talk about in this, not only the Communist Party. So this is a photograph that captures an object that doesn't exist anymore. It was made in 1930, and this is a propaganda cart. So it's agitational propaganda, and it's using good modern design from the advertising workshop in the Bauhaus. On this little cart, they've clearly hired or somehow convinced this local boy to go around with this wheelbarrow, basically, with this cart, and it says 10th of August, anti-war demonstration, workers. Basically says, you shouldn't be cannon fodder for the next war. Demonstrate with the Communist Party against fascism and the danger of war. And they use these kind of symbols here to get people's attention against what they're against, Nazism equals death, something like that. So this is also not the standard story of what Bauhaus design does, that it's just kind of agitational propaganda. And there was, from 1927 on, there was an active communist cell in the Bauhaus with members who, once in maybe it's the same in the UK. In the US, you can join any part, you can join a part, well, you can join one of the two parties. I mean, you can join sub-parties, but it never costs anything. So I always have to say, at least to North American audiences, that you had to pay a significant amount, actually, if you were going to be in the Communist Party. And a lot of these students didn't have that much money. So that means something, that they were joining up. Other students were just sort of associated with them, weren't actual members. And they had basically this little zine that they were reproducing through hectography, which is a super low tech way of reproducing paper. And this was their communist magazine. So it's called the Kostufra, the Communist Student Fraction. That's the group. And this is their Bauhaus. And there are, I think, about 15 issues that they put out. A lot of them are, inter-organizational problems. They're calling out Mies van der Rohe, who was the third director of the school, for trying to shut down political activity on the part of the students, which he was doing because he was trying to save the institution. He also was just kind of bossy. This was had national distribution. There were people who had subscriptions to it outside of the Bauhaus, and it was distributed clandestinely within the Bauhaus. So it was actually an official communist journal. And what I end up arguing is that through this communist phase, that they do some pretty interesting things. So this is a photograph by Ethel Mittag-Foder, who was one of the communist students. And it's of Albert Menzel and Lotte Rothschild, who were both students there, met and fell in love and eventually married. she was murdered at Auschwitz, so she's important for my next project. But I read this photograph, I love the way they're posed together, and I love, what they're doing. So it's a great photograph and these kind of S curves of the bodies together. But I like it that he's just totally intent on saying what he's saying, and she's just kind of relaxing and considering it. So I see this as a moment of a kind of new model of heterosexual partnership that is much more egalitarian and offers a kind of communist way of loving, in a way. But I also want to look at then what the design is that comes out of that. So Lena Meyer Bergner, who was a weaver, ends up going to the Soviet Union with Hannes Meyer, who she eventually marries. A lot of Bauhaus members ended up in the Soviet Union. And here she designs this kind of, it's slightly terrifying, but also kind of great, this super technologized society of trams and buildings and no people because it's weaving that was woven into cloth. And she designed fabric for furniture manufacture in the Soviet Union, which was kind of the great exciting experiment of the time. And consequently, it was also the thing that most people in Germany who were kind of in the center, were really afraid of. They were not afraid of Nazism, which is what, looking back, we know they should have been afraid of. They saw the famines happening in the Soviet Union and a lot of other things not going well in this experiment, the ongoing revolution, lots of death, and they were afraid of that. From my perspective, quite far away, it's also kind of a beautiful experiment to think of building a new society of egalitarianism. And my son when he was 4 once pinned in his car seat, and I was driving and spouting off about something. I said something about communism, and I started to explain it to him, and he said, I know, Mommy, it's where everyone was supposed to share everything, except it didn't quite work out. And which I think is a good characterization of Soviet communism. So this was definitely a force in the Bauhaus. And if you'd like me to talk about it, I can also talk about the other side, which is part of what I want to do is take the Bauhaus off of its pedestal and not just say that it's, that they're all heroes or that they all had good intentions, but that National Socialism was a part of the institution too. I am.
So towards the end of your book, you talk about how Fritz Ertl became head of planning Auschwitz new concentration camps in 1940. You write that when considered together, these buildings' simplicity, whilst not isn't initiated by Ertl, is the basis of the concentration camp architecture. Garishly echoes Bauhaus design principles, and their modern efficiency modeled Bauhaus planning and production twisted to serve genocide. And to what extent was Bauhaus paving the way or complicit with the Nazis, and to what extent did it suggest an alternative future?
Give me 1 second. I want to show you guys different images that are not in that book. Here we go. Can you see?
Yeah.
Okay, besides me looking concernedly into the camera. Let me just think about your question for a second. The story, a lot of what I'm interested in general, I guess, as an art historian and as a historian, when I hear stories being told over and over again that I just know are not true, the alarm bells start to go in my head. And so as I was working on Haunted Bauhaus, this thing that I address in the 5th chapter, which is, that the Bauhaus was political and that makes sense, led me to look at, okay, communism is incredibly important for the design and what they're doing, but Nazism is also there. And you can read accounts of an American student a Swiss student who wrote home and then anonymously published an account of his experiences there. He was anti-political and really was kind of liked Mies van der Rohe's approach, but he said, it was horrible going into the canteen or the dining hall because you either had to sit on the communist side or the Nazi side. That was pretty interesting to me. And there are people, like Fritz Ertl, who were at the Bauhaus. So the normal story that you'll hear much more are things like what you see in this article, which is true, which is that in April 1933, the Bauhaus was already existing in a very diminished form in Berlin. It was a small, basically architecture school, some interior design, and it was still a Nazi target. So the authorities, the SA and local police come and accuse them of having communist materials. They probably planted some in the school and closed the school down. They were told, Mies van der Rohe was told they'd be able to reopen if they brought the school into line with Nazi policy. So they needed to fire all foreigners, including Vasily Kandinsky, who had become a German citizen and was arguably the most famous painter in Europe at the time, and get rid of any foreign students, other things like that, and teach, of course, good German things. Mies and the other masters got together and talked about it and agreed they would shut the school down rather than complying. And then they opened a bottle of champagne, which I think is classy. They do definitely reject Nazism, but there's a real love of telling that story and then jumping immediately to say, like, more or less, and then they all go away and talk about how Walter Gropius comes to the US. He's in the UK first, but usually that gets skipped over, and teaches at Harvard. Laszlo Moholy-Nagy teaches at the new Bauhaus, founds the new Bauhaus in Chicago, and then teaches at subsequent iterations of that. Black Mountain College is where the Alperses go. People like Santi Shavinsky teach there too. We know that many Bauhäusler were scattered to the wind and used teaching Bauhaus methods in places like Japan or eventually Australia. So it really does become a diaspora. All that said, the vast majority of Bauhaus members stayed in Nazi Germany and they didn't stop working. And even, people like Walter Gropius designed for Harvard, designed the new law school, but they also joined up to the Nazi Reich Chamber of Culture. This is Gropius's membership card. And they did design work that included the imagery of the new regime. This is Walter Gropius and Rudolf Hillebrecht's submission for a proposal that they weren't even picked. But so, I'm interested in how the Bauhaus building, I talk about this a bit at the end of Haunted Bauhaus, that the Nazis are like, hey, we're going to really stick it to the Bauhaus because they have this big giant building in a place where they need buildings. So the Bauhaus remains and gets used as a school, but they turn it into a home ec school and also a school for Nazi officers. They put swastika imagery on it. But so that's part of the story that I'm telling, but I'm also interested in the fact that there are people like Fritz Ertl, and I'm just looking, I don't have any images of him or of his work, and I'm still figuring out what I want to show or say about him, because I certainly don't want to glorify him, but I think it's important to tell the story of this architect who was in the SS, who was clearly a committed Nazi and ended up in charge of gas chamber and crematorium construction at Auschwitz, which is where a number of his fellow Bauhaus members were murdered. So, I always am allergic to our tendency to make heroes out of art movements or artists, and I want to undercut that. But I also just want to not tell it like it is, because there's too much information for it to tell a comprehensive, objective story of Bauhaus members under Nazism. But the fact that they were there, that they were creating designs like this, Herbert Bayer doing an incredibly modern, skilled ad man, doing design work for the Germany exhibition, this lamp that I showed you before, mine was probably made in the GDR. It was made throughout the Nazi period. Designs by Margarete Friedlander Wildenhain, who was Jewish and had to flee, were still produced throughout the Nazi period because, just not with her name attached to it. We love this story, I think, of, Nazis saw all modern art as degenerate, and I picture it as like, as garlic to the werewolf, so modern art to the Nazi. We have this simplistic story of how art was deployed and used under Nazi Germany. And what was really going on was, like everything else under Nazism, very diverse. There were some people who were totally, only wanted to recreate the old masters and throw anything modern out. But there were certainly plenty of people who wanted modern design, to help create convincing propaganda for the masses, or, to create film advertising and distraction for the masses. Ilse Fehling was a sculptor, but she ended up doing costume design in, light, fluffy comedies, or also ideological films. So, I'm trying to follow a whole bunch of people to tell a pretty complicated, but I think very interesting story of how artists, sometimes despite themselves, kind of kept the regime going, sometimes supported it despite their own intentions, in a case like Herbert Bayer, or enthusiastically really supported it, like Fritz Ertel, as you mentioned. Maybe I'll just show you one last example that I think is pretty helpful, which is the case of Franz Ehrlich, who was, like people I've mentioned before, was a communist Bauhaus member, was making anti-Nazi propaganda, and was caught and put in Buchenwald concentration camp, which is on the outskirts of Weimar, where the Bauhaus first started. And he was being made to perform slave labor, with very high death rates. That was, of course, part of the point. But he saw they had a design office, and he walked in and said, "I'm an architect, put me to work." While he was enslaved, he used, a Bauhaus sans serif font to create the gates of Buchenwald with, this mean slogan, "To each his own." Basically, if you're here, it's what you deserve. And also go on to create housing for SS members. That's, this kind of icky, retro, fake German design, but it also does have sleek modern elements in the swastika, in the use of exposed beams. It's a kind of hybrid old new form of modernity. And to design things like the zoo at the concentration camp that was created for the SS officers' children to visit, and to also create the obvious parallel between the dehumanizing and rendering the human prisoners, as animals, while also comparing them to animals who were given more freedom and more humane treatment than the prisoners themselves. After he was freed, Fritz Ertel continued to work for this office in Buchenwald. He did apply to transfer to not be working there and was denied. I think he's a good case. It's easy, I think, when we look at this, to try to decide who was on the right side of history, and most people were not. But, especially with what I think we've been through politically here in the US, I was quite motivated to move away from, I think there's always a fantasy when we're looking back that we would have done the right thing. And living under a regime myself that was putting children in cages and, reducing all kinds of human rights and just taking advantage, just bullying. I again felt like we can never know that we would have done the right thing. I certainly felt powerless when I was living under a regime doing all kinds of things I thought were bad. And I think it's important to go back and retell the story of this movement in such an incredibly morally compromised atmosphere. And so that's what I'm working on, especially starting more in earnest next year, when I'll be a fellow starting in September at the Getty.
I think all your research is just, it's really illuminating on the Bauhaus as a whole, and I find that so exciting.
I also think of it as, I think this is an approach that one could do, and many have done for other movements. I think of all the feminist work on surrealism, or, my first teachers when I was working on Cubism, with Mark Antliff and Patricia Layton, female cubists were seen usually as later and pretty peripheral to the movement. But I started looking at the work of Marie Laurencin and realizing like she was a peripheral cubist, but she was also tied to this, lesbian neoclassical circle. Like there were all these images of women making out in her work that nobody was talking about. So, I think it's the fun part of any research to start asking questions about why we're seeing things that don't fit the story we're being told, and what other stories, of course we can't know all of history. If we spend all our time recreating everybody's story, we'd never have time to live ourselves. But the stories we tend to tell seem to me to be about white, straight male genius over and over again. And I'm, for one, am tired of that. So, I think there's a lot to be done in many corners of society to tell stories that really happened and look at work that really was made.
Yeah, no, I think it's a fantastic book. Well, this one is, and I'm sure the next one will be.
Thanks. Yeah, it would have been fun over wine. I might have crapped out halfway through if I got into the second glass of wine and been like, tell me about yourself. Yeah.
But it's also because, your time's it's 4:30 now, is it? Something like that?
quarter to 5. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But when I get the adrenaline going, I can talk a lot. I'm a little deflated afterwards, but I'm going to make myself some coffee. Well, I'm really happy for you guys with things starting to open up more. And
yeah, it's nice. It's been really nice just being able to socialize a bit more.
My estimation is that everyone is between 10 and 20% funnier than they were otherwise. It's just so nice to be with other people and crack jokes.
Yeah. I'm surprised at how much I've actually missed it. I can actually, if I go out and see people now, I really just notice it the next day, or I really notice things in the way that I probably wouldn't have done years ago. Like you would just go out and you see people and you feel good. And now it's almost like a real adrenaline or something. It just feels.
Yeah, that the interactions with actual people actually physically near you is, no, I agree. A friend turned 50 and I brought her some champagne and she was like, oh, stay. And some other people dropped by and we were all more or less done with our second vaccines. It was so fun. People, I find myself saying people are a really great invention, but then I think about my work and I think kind of a mixed bag actually, but it does seem to me like I feel so quickly though too that it's the good things we're going back to, but also the bad things. Looking at my research, I find myself, looking to see if I could take the train there, but it just isn't really feasible. So I'll be flying again a fair amount. And, habits that during this break, I've thought can we change our lives? Can we change the way we do things more? I'm glad to be able to be together like this without a huge carbon footprint. That's one thing. Maybe that'll stay a bit more.
Well, we're definitely thinking of doing, because we would like to go back to doing stuff in the pub again. But we'd like to then, I think there's real possibilities of stuff that will change after all this has happened. I don't exactly know what it will be, what good things and what bad things will come out of this, I guess. So,
yeah, hopefully we'll all keep appreciating each other and be kind.
Yes, that would be nice.
Thank you for listening. This has been the Exploding Appendix podcast. If you like this and you'd like to check out more of our work, please visit www.explodingappendix.com or follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, SoundCloud or YouTube. Exploding Appendix, ideas and culture with guts.